I am a lecturer in Modern Languages and Cultures department, and so on that note, I really want to thank also the translators who've been doing a fabulous job in making me kind of able to follow all of what was going on. So thank you very much again for your work. My talk is entitled Monsters of the Capitalocene, Zombies, the Apocalypse, and Cheap Nature. And I realize I'm the only thing that separates you from lunch, so I'm trying to, speed through it, not too fast, so we can go and have a break. In 28 Days Later, you may know the film. It's from 2002, it's a British film. It's famous for introducing the first fast zombies. So in this film, an army major who leads a surviving all-male unit of soldiers, only men, he holds a zombie-esque infected captive in order to study his behavior. So he has this zombie locked up in his yard. What the major learns from him is the following, and I quote, and this is on the slide also: the zombie will never bake bread. He will never plant crops, raise livestock. He's futureless. The major's observation may seem obvious, but there's much at stake here, I would think. And I think also in general, cultural studies and literature, I think, does have a lot to contribute to these debates around the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene and so forth. Because I think, from my perspective, from the stuff I've read, news isn't good, and that knowledge has been around for a while. It's not only since the 1950s. So anyway, to get back to the zombies here, it is well-known truism in pop cultural zombie studies that whether fast or slow, zombies run on energy that should not really exist. Energy cannot be created from nothing, and obviously I'm speaking to scientists here, so I don't need to say that. Whether accumulated over millions of years in the shape of fossil fuels, stored up in an as yet unfarmed tract of land, or produced by the racialized labor power, and thus murderously extracted from enslaved populations, or indeed from the reproductive labor of domesticated, quote-unquote, women, energy is not created out of nothing, even though, and this is the key point, capitalism has historically behaved as though it was, so degrading landscapes and treating a whole range of peoples, obviously awfully, and that's something that I want to talk about more. In the apocalyptic world of 28 Days Later, in which society's infrastructure has collapsed, accessing energy of any sorts, whether food, petrol, or labor power, is becoming increasingly difficult. Throughout much of the film, the survivors have to make do with a high-sugar diet composed of junk foods, the leftovers of a society that was running on oil, processed foods, and so forth from around the globe. So it's not just the zombies who can no longer grow their own food. In fact, it's a whole society that no longer grows their own food and goes to Tesco or whatever the equivalent is to get their foods, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong with the relations between humans nowadays and extra-human natures. And that is something that literatures from around the globe have reflected on for a long time. So in the film, the response to apocalypse by the white and rampantly sexist army major is increasing masculinist militarization, a reaction that renders all too visible the racist and sexist makeup of the collapsing social order. What do zombies, apocalyptic and monstrous imaginaries, have to contribute to current debates around the Anthropocene? I would say a lot, since what a particular society fears, how it imagines whom it defines as the non-human or the not quite human, who is not included in this term of the Anthropocene, right? And indeed, how it imagines the end of the world. So how is it all coming to an end for us? It reveals a lot about the system that we live in and also about the conceptual limitations of our imagination. So to start, I want to call on Jason Moore's useful distinction between different employments of the term Anthropocene. So there's the geological concept that we've heard a lot about, And that may indeed be a useful and formal concept to the scientific community. And I have little, in a sense, to contribute to this. But then, of course, there's also what one might call the popular Anthropocene, which more understands as a way of thinking the origins and the evolution of the modern ecological crisis. So in a way, our kind of approach now to thinking about why we're in the mess that we're in. Jason Moore argues that the term Anthropocene, in this second sense, is in fact very dangerous, and I would agree. It's the environmentalist concept of our times, and it is a dangerous falsification, a colossal falsification, he says. Related terms, such as anthropogenic climate change, fall within the same category. They rely on an abstract concept of humanity. And so they all but dissolve the question of responsibility. And that's also the possibility for meaningful resistance, I would think. If it's humanity in the abstract causing all of this, well, what are we going to do about it? Not only are we not equally responsible for climate change, but also we are not equally affected by it. As Neil Smith reminds us, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. The contours of disaster and the difference between who lives and who dies is, to a greater or lesser extent, a social calculus. And of course, when we switch on the news, we see that ongoing around the globe. We only need to think about the effects of the hurricane at the moment on Haiti. Indeed, as Evan Calder-Williams, and this is also on the slide here, notes, he has observed in his cultural study of apocalyptic imaginaries, the apocalypse is already here, just not all at the same time, not all visible to all of us at the same time. In this spirit, Moore proposes the term Capitalocene as a conceptual tool for thinking the present and thus thinking resistance. It is the capitalist system which thrives on the exploitation of workers, so much we know, but also, and perhaps more importantly, on the permanent degradation of the natural environments and also on unpaid labor power. And I've here chosen this wonderful picture that very insultingly illustrates how much we all should enjoy domestic labor as women. That is, capitalism relies on the appropriation of the unpaid work and energy of human and extra-human natures. And this is what we've heard before, what Moore calls cheap natures. And let's here perhaps briefly note that Moore folds the human back into the term nature as matrix. So when he says the exploitation of cheap nature, he includes human people within that, right? Whether unpaid labor or devalued labor. So nature, it's not nature plus humans, it's humans within nature and nature within humans. So capitalism vampirically feeds on extra economic resources, on unpaid and undervalued labor, on gendered and racialized bodies, and on extra human natural resources, so that be fresh soils, oil, and forests, which are left permanently degraded. Capitalism is thus, as we've heard before, a world ecology, a historically specific, in the long run, fundamentally unsustainable way of organizing human and extra-human natures via abstract relations of ever-increasing inequality. What I argue then is that zombie effects, the various different and shifting zombie figures and tropes, and I realize that often when I speak to audiences who don't know much about zombies, they're not quite aware of the manifold zombie manifestations that there are, but the ones that we know, they're actually just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. I'll give you more examples as we go along. Zombie effects are animated by the combined logics of exploitation and appropriation, by the relations between value and non-value. Representations of exploited labor, of the reduction of a person to a body that sells hours of its time are thus only one particular zombie effect. And of course, that's the most popular zombie figure, right? We all know the zombie who kind of has vacant eyes, walks slowly, and works in a factory or, works on the plantations. one of the main kind of zombie representations that we have, plus, of course, the fast zombie. I'll get to that in a minute. So the zombie, I would say, is not a static figure. In fact, it is animated by the inner logics of capitalism, and there are a variety of zombie figures, even though the dominant figures, of course, are the ones that we tend to know via Hollywood cinema. So, hence we also get, for instance, and those are often forgotten, so this is an example of the laboring zombie, sorry, crazy. But we also get female zombies in early cinema, from the United States, but there's a longer history of literatures about female zombification also. Female characters zombified by a male character who wants to control their bodies and desires. They're thus not workers in the sense of, the workers in a factory, but they do register the gendered experience of capitalist processes of accumulation. In other words, the larger relations of reproduction largely carried out by women and identified, women are often historically identified with the quote-unquote natural realm. And there's another example of one of these early zombies. The one on the left, in fact, is the zombie, not very comparable to the zombies we nowadays know, right? But anyway. So a key feature of capitalism then, according to Roswitha Schultz, is thus value dissociation. A core of female-determined reproductive activities and affects, characteristics and attitudes, so emotionality, sensuality, and female and motherly caring, are dissociated from value and abstract labor. A world ecological version of this theory might be that it is cheap natures, unpaid work and energy that are dissociated from value and abstract labor. But to get back to the question of the Anthropocene and the monsters and zombies, I would say that monsters and zombies are about the limits of the abstraction of the human, the anthropos. More than any other figure, I would claim, the figure reveals modern anxieties concerning the relation between humans, or better, human animals, and the rest of nature. Zombies within the dominant tradition, as embodied in the US films that you've just seen, are mere bodies, nature minus spirit. But there are very important variations on this. There's a long tradition of rebellious zombies, in fact, that fight against various forms of systemic, structural, and physical violence done to humans. To take a couple of examples, for example, Jean Zombie was a famous revolutionary fighter during the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And indeed, many contemporary 20th century Caribbean zombie novels feature zombies that seek to de-zombify themselves, right? So they kind of no longer want to be zombies, and and a lot of it revolves around rethinking the place of humans, quote unquote, within their natural environments. But in any case, to stay with the most widespread version of the zombie figure for the purpose of this paper, these bodily zombies represent the workers' alienation not only from their own bodies, but also from the land that they work on. As they produce global products for consumers they never meet, so if we're here talking, for example, of the plantations obviously produce sugar for a global market, which then determines their livelihoods, right? So if, say, sugar prices go down, then that has a very real effect on the workers on those plantations. So they're working on monocultural fields, and monocultural fields, of course, are profoundly destructive to local environments. Zombies have their origins, Zombies have their origins in the Caribbean sugar plantations, which constituted a paradigmatic moment in the emergence of capitalism in that they produced a single product for a global market and globalized, racialized labor divisions and also food productions, right? So they produced sugar for a global market. And what is here also important to note is that, those plantations, obviously, they were atrocious in human terms, importing enslaved labor, And they were also environmentally highly destructive. So they relied on deforestation, which in turn then produced all sorts of other problems. Changes in rain patterns, soil erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these problems date back a long time in the Caribbean context. And so the zombies' origin, they kind of force us to take this longer history into account. However, the moment that I am most interested in here for the moment is the moment when the zombies migrated into US cinema in their reified form as a direct result of the US occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1934, when sensationalist writers such as William Seabrook, you see here an illustration from his book. You clearly, even in the illustrations, you can see the kind of racist tenor that the book as a whole has. And Seabrook went in search of exotic fodder for a global market. The cultural critic Stephen Shapiro argues that, a lot of these books and the films that were influenced by Seabrook's book, they seem fascinated by the possibility of American hemispheric imperialism as an enabling solution to the Depression era's failures. Foreign racialized workers, as you see them represented here, are providing a cheap and compliant labor force in those kind of films and books. In that sense, it is of course true that the early zombie in US cinema was an ideologically charged and racist figure of otherness. However, I would suggest that it was also overdetermined, as it simultaneously registered the disenfranchisement and dispossession of the Haitian labor force as US capital entered the country. Within those films, I have to say that was usually disavowed, so it's registered in displaced form. But also at the time, within Haiti, tales of zombification circulated, and they would enter the literary imagination through works by Haitian writers such as Jacques Roumain and Gouverneur de la Rosée from 1944, in which we find images of degraded landscapes and figuratively zombified peasants. And of course, we need to remember that the time of the US occupation was both brutal towards the Haitian populations and also highly damaging and leaving a long-term damage in terms of the natural landscapes of Haiti, based on extractivism, sugar plantations, but then also deforestation and selling timber for the global markets. But to return to the US films of the period, I would therefore argue that they registered in this displaced form the socio-ecological crisis of new imperialism. By the 1930s, US imperialism had resulted in degraded and deforested soils in Haiti, while in the US, the socio-ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl had been the product of the drive for white territorial control, the displacing of and war against indigenous communities and their agricultural practices, and a push towards an agriculture that was based around crops for export. In US literature, we hence find figures of displaced Okies driven from the lands by environmental disaster. One might say that the zombie in its cinematic form, a laboring body who's disconnected from his environment and thus unable to produce his own food locally, so the zombie in those films always works on someone else's plantation, emerged during a time of widespread socio-ecological crisis that was the product of US imperial expansion both at home and also abroad. Now, I want to turn to the period that my colleague here talked about before, when geologists argue that the period Anthropocene should start. And in zombie terms, this is also clearly noticed. As any zombie fan will know, there's a major shift in zombie representations that took place in 1968 with the release of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Romero's zombies They would never stop in their path to till any land or work on any plantation. You may know the film, right? They're all kind of joining up in an attack on an abandoned farmhouse, right? So again, very symbolic, of course. They do not listen to any orders of any zombie master. Indeed, the aesthetics of sugar plantations and toiling bodies are replaced by iconic shots of bloodthirsty ghouls wandering across an otherwise deserted landscape, and then culminates in this instinct-driven attack on the farmhouse. Still, I think that the imagery is here clearly registering a rift between humans and the environments they inhabit. But the form that this takes has radically shifted from these earlier films. This film here places consistent visual emphasis. Now we go back to the cars. Persistent visual emphasis on fossil fuel transport, registering the widespread abandonment of the countryside under petrocapitalism, so the kind of process of urbanization. Indeed, the film starts with a prolonged sequence of a car's journey to the famous cemetery where it all starts, and as a destination metonymically evokes the protagonists to, sorry, I lost my place here. Basically, the journey here kind of metonymically evokes the journey of the protagonists from the big cities where they live, where all the industry is located, to the deserted rural landscape where no one ever lives anymore. There's only dead people that they find and people rising from the graves, right? So again, very, very symbolic in those terms, in terms of the representations of the relations between the country and the city on the other hand. So in Romero's film, oil and oil culture takes center stage. Oil is both what protects and ultimately destroys human life. So this is the farmhouse that they run to, and there are some shots here of the emphasis that is placed on, the need for fuel. Because if only you've got a functioning car, then you'll be fine. Problem is, of course, that oil always runs out, and then you can no longer escape. So, we get here this association again with fast driving and being alive that has become so kind of popularized within our cultural understanding of modernity, right? So the point here is visualized in the opposition between the fast driving humans and the very slow, stumbling zombies that defy the linear temporality of petromodernity and indeed its ideals of speed and progress. And so we see a lot of zombies. They're frequently shot in the same frame as cars, right? They're always trying to grab their way in. And as long as the car works, it's fine. But as I said before, they always break down, and that's the problem. In this context, the gas pump becomes the prime site of terror. The film's infamous scene of cannibalism takes place just after a failed attempt to get petrol from the pump, resulting in the young couple being blown up in the car. So we get canted shots, shaky handheld camera movements that create a sense of panic as the car and also metonymically normalized car culture explodes. This association between zombies, oil, and car culture quickly became the new dominant, and we see it now in every zombie film, pretty much. It's getting almost boring, right? Everything always explodes. And Romero's iconic exploding petrol station emerged as a well-established cinematic trope. To contextualize this, the late 60s and early 70s were the tipping point for US hegemony and the second global food regime that was established through oil-fueled industrialization of agriculture. So on the one hand, Romero's zombies are, of course, the creatures of a new petro-modern world ecology that took place in the US during the 1950s with the rise of suburbia and automobile culture, with the emergence of oil-fueled global transport networks, with the racialized destruction of small holdings in the American South, and the gradual transformation of wheat and cattle into rivers of seed and flesh. But they also emerge at a time when that world ecological order is in crisis. So, that link between zombies and crisis is, of course, very evident. Romero's film offers a critical view, thus, of the rise of the US as an imperial superpower, which is epitomized in the film which is epitomized by the contemporaneous destruction of Vietnamese lives and lands in a controversial war that was also notably fueled by oil. Romero's zombies expose the limitations of the Green Revolution, also exposed the limitations of the Green Revolution, which, of course, as we all know, was a fundamental change in agricultural relations and food getting, and introduced industrial techniques into agriculture, including the use of agrochemicals, oil-based machinery, and hybridized seeds from the 1940s onwards. So here's where, our kind of temporalities begin to match up, really. Developing through the deepening of the division between humans and extra-human environments, this was the fossil-fueled revolution that gave rise to today's endless monocultural fields and terrifyingly cramped animal farming. As we are now very well aware, the 20th century productivity revolution had been paid for by cheap oil, by the exhaustion of soils and water reservoirs, by ignoring traditional farming knowledge and disregarding natural limits. It is this revolution that was reaching its limits, its tipping point. And so in that sense, Romero's film proved prophetic of the pivotal year of 1973. Now, if zombies are fueled by our alienation from extra-human natures, if they thrive at moments of systemic ecological crisis, then it may be in one sense unsurprising that they're becoming ever more violent, cannibalistic, and faster at a time of increased financialization, of the hollowing out of communal and welfare structures, of global land grabbing, and rampant privatization. As Robert R. Britton writes in Let Them Eat Junk, our increasingly globalized capitalist economy is using more and more energy to run faster and faster, while actually losing ground when it comes to advancing human well-being. Zombies are running faster and faster, and they replenish their energy by feasting on whatever is left of humanity. So in a sense, again, reflecting this kind of spread of capitalism into every single corner of what is left of our private lives also, if we think of Facebook and whatnot. Colonizing each corner of the globe. So the question for me of why do zombies become faster, which has fascinated so many zombie fans, is actually for me not the most interesting question. I think it's kind of fairly obvious. Obviously, we're reaching a tipping point. Everything is faster and faster. Environmental degradation is becoming more and more obvious. And if they're indeed thriving on crisis, then also, hence, they're becoming more and more aggressive. That might be here a simplified version of my longer argument. But I think that the more interesting question to look at is the recent phenomenon in mainstream zombie imagination, which is the turn towards the sentient zombie and the shift in narrative voice, which, as Stephen Shapiro has remarked, surely marks a major shift and the emergence of new structures of feeling. So suddenly we're identifying with the zombies now again, are we? And we might here list iZombie, In the Flesh, or perhaps even a zombie leader in The Land of the Dead. Now let me reiterate here again that this is not new, of course. There are plenty of talking and sentient zombie characters in the literary tradition of the Caribbean, and these zombie characters reflect on their fate and contemplate solutions, right? So zombies in that tradition are not what we need to fear. What we need to fear is the processes that zombify you. And I guess, that kind of recognition is kind of becoming, again, more dominant in the mainstream kind of cinematic tradition now. So I do find this development within the filmic and serial production from within the core countries interesting. Stephen Shapiro brilliantly suggests that these new zombie imaginaries, which he sees as functioning as a transistor of still indeterminate thinking about a particular social crisis, so a trial ground for how do we imagine the future, what are we supposed to do about it, what is going on, that they rehearse an ongoing rearrangement of class alliances, within these quite high budget formats, but taking very kind of low popular narratives. I mean, zombie films used to be, used to run on very low budgets, whereas now we see the opposite of that emerging. So what I might here add is that, and I don't know yet what to make of this development fully, but if we accept the speculative claim of Shapiro's, then we must also emphasize that there's an internationalist dimension to it, in that it crosses core peripheral divides. Figures emerging from anti-colonial, decolonial, and post-colonial writing and causes are here becoming allied with those of the working and middle classes of core countries, such as the US. So that in itself, I think, is a very interesting new phenomenon. But where does all of this leave us with regards to the question of environmental crisis and the Anthropocene/Capitalocene? The zombie, as we have seen, is a figure reduced to its bodily existence, revealing humanity's fundamental animality. Zombies subvert the notion that nature is external and controllable, that humans alone make history. The zombie and the settings within which the figure appears refuse to be safely confined to the realm of nature without humans. Zombies stubbornly deny human exceptionalism. So from that perspective, that kind of very utopian kind of version of the Anthropocene, of how we could overcome the problems that we're now facing and so forth, I have my doubts. The crisis that we're talking about is very long in origins indeed, and there's evidence of that, since the 15th century, and there has been plenty of evidence in cultural production throughout these centuries, and especially with the beginning, of course, of petro-modernity. So I do think that it's unlikely that we will become super creatures, and perhaps more likely, as these films suggest, that in fact animality and nature, quote unquote, will take its toll. So these zombies then highlight, sometimes critically, sometimes very uncritically indeed, that the processes through which capitalism develops, the dissociation and devaluing of nature, including most of human natures. The zombie, which still resembles us enough to produce horror, lies at the intersection of what is defined as lying outside the realm of the fully human, defined in opposition to the exploitable natural realm that at various points included women, enslaved peoples, religious minorities, and so forth. As Jason Moore puts it, the boundary setting between what was and what was not natural was intellectually arbitrary. Intellectually arbitrary it may be, but it's also fundamentally racist and patriarchal. The zombie is, as McNally writes in The Monsters of the Market, a product of a monstrous system that systematically threatens the integrity of human personhood and thingifies human capacities. But I would add here, the zombie is also a product of a monstrous system that is based on undermining its own conditions of reproducibility through its fundamentally unsustainable approach to nature, to women, and to the colonies, in the terms of Maria Mies. So I'm not as optimistic as Crutzen and Stefan in their famous 2002 piece, and I think there's plenty of evidence for that. And also, if we look globally, to conclude with Williams's words, the apocalypse is already happening, and we need to become aware of these injustices. The human, I think, is not one big undefined thing. We need to be aware of differentiations within it and how we're differently inhabiting the environment. Thank you.